Hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar on what makes a good online lesson in veterinary education with Nicola Smith, Senior Lecturer at Massey University, New Zealand. My name is Charlotte and I will be hosting this event. Before we begin, I'd like to run through some housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and shared with all registrants, so if you do have to leave early, you won't miss out. If you'd like to ask a question at any time throughout the webinar, please enter your question in the Q&A dialog box accessible from your Zoom toolbar. There will be a live Q&A session with Nicola at the end of the session, so we do recommend that you submit your questions. Before I pass over to Nicola to discuss what makes a good online lesson in veterinary education, I'd like to give a brief overview of AD Instruments. Nicola has worked with AD Instruments to develop a comprehensive online curriculum for veterinary education. At AD Instruments, we create industry-leading software and hardware tools for life science researchers and educators. LT is our online learning platform with ready-to-use content for life sciences, chemistry, nursing, medical, and veterinary courses. LT is used in over 250 institutions globally and comes with over 500 interactive and fully customizable lessons and labs for active learning, whether you're teaching in the lab or remotely. LT's veterinary physiology collection, developed in partnership with Nicola at Massey University, contains 60 professionally designed veterinary physiology lessons, complete with clinical case studies. To learn more about the collection, visit adi.to/vetphys. This will be added to the chat during the webinar. With housekeeping over, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Nicola Smith, to the floor. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you for that introduction. Can I just check with you, Charlotte, that, oh, no, everything is working as it should, and I'm not sure that that is quite right.
We might be having slight technical difficulties.
We might be having slight technical difficulties. Let me just stop that share for a second and just try that again. As you said, Charlotte, earlier, what is a... Yeah, no, I've got the same problem as I had before, Charlotte. I was going to say, what is a webinar without a technical difficulty? So I'm just going to have to reopen my browser here, I think, and just see if I can get that window up there again. How's that? Does that look better? No.
Let's see.
It will in a second.
Yes, perfect. And we can see your...
In the end, and if I just start my video, we might all finally get there. So are we good, Charlotte?
Yes, you're good. Take it away.
Okay, now I feel like this is a regular class and I'm more comfortable. So we've got the technical bit out of the way. So thanks for that introduction, Charlotte. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about online lessons and what makes them good or not. Though perhaps in retrospect, a better title might have been what makes an effective online lesson, because after all, that's what it's all about. So right at the beginning, I'd just like to state right from the outset that I am not an instructional designer. I'm just an academic who's got slightly too much to do, but who happens to be interested in teaching, especially blended learning designs. So what I want to do today is just share some of my experiences with writing online lessons that I've learned over the last 10 years or so, including what I've learned from the education literature, from the instructional designers that I've been fortunate to work with, and of course my students who are never shy about giving me feedback about what's working and what isn't for them. The other thing I should mention is what you're seeing on your screen now that I've actually managed to get it up there. So we use LT at the vet school here at Massey for our lesson building, as our lesson building platform. And so this is what you're looking at right now if you're unfamiliar with LT. So it's not exactly designed for presentation purposes, but I thought it was an appropriate way of presenting today. And it also gives me the opportunity to show you some examples and what those look like directly when I'm using LT. So the only problem with this is that sometimes I might not manage to get it to fit your screen perfectly, but I'll do my best. So let's start by discussing briefly why we might want to create an online lesson in the first place. So usually most of the time people are using online lessons these days, it's to deliver asynchronous learning for students. And that's really useful because it means students can work at a time and a place and a pace that suits them. I also find it's really great for freeing up staff time. So instead of repeating content delivery over and over again, instead they can use their time a little bit more effectively, if you like, to develop quality interactive face-to-face teaching opportunities such as small group teaching or an interactive tutorial or whatever needs to be happening. I've also found asynchronous lessons really, really fantastic for standardizing content. And so by that, I mean making sure that everybody who is teaching into a course is using a standard approach and terminology, and that all teachers are sticking to the learning objectives, because I think we all have that colleague that likes to go rogue and talk about their latest research interest at some length. However, having said all of that, online lessons can be used as part of a synchronous class as well, and that's actually how I started using them. So about sort of 9 or 10 years ago, I was tasked with implementing a case-based learning course, and this involved students working through cases in small groups. And so initially I would put the case material up on a central projector screen and then move it on gradually as students work through the case. But as you can imagine, that got quite frustrating because the groups that work quite quickly would finish ahead of time and start chatting about what they were going to do on the weekend instead. And then some of the other groups weren't quite keeping up with the pace. So just moving to an online delivery format meant that every group could work at the pace that suited them, and we got better engagement as a result. However, it wasn't really long before I realized that there was a second reason that's a lot more exciting about why an online lesson might be a good idea as part of your course design, and that is to enhance learning. So for my case-based small groups who were getting online lessons just as a form of delivery, I found that if I actually started structuring them, scaffolding them, putting some questions in there to slow them down and to check their learning, I found that I could pretty much embed a lot of the facilitation within that actual lesson, and that it was quite easy to get students much more actively involved in their learning in a way that was more effective than me running around and trying to keep up with every group. Because I should mention at this particular point in time that I had quite a large cohort of around 120 students, but usually only 1 or 2 staff members to help facilitate. If you had a facilitator for each group, then that wouldn't have been such a problem. So by embedding some of this facilitation within the online lesson, I found I didn't have to keep repeating myself with each group, or I didn't have to keep interrupting the flow of work for each group by pulling the class together to talk about something that everyone was having trouble with. So instead, every group moved through the case at their own pace, and I could concentrate on working with the groups that really needed some additional help. And then later on, I could look at the class's work overall and decide whether I needed to do any more intervention in terms of correcting misconceptions in a feedback post, etc., or if a group had gone a little bit fast and their work was a bit superficial, talking to them at the beginning of the next class to make sure that they were actually meeting the objectives. So as I got better at structuring these lessons that encouraged students to get actively involved, I started to see some results that I really liked in terms of improved student outcomes. And so I got enthusiastic and I started incorporating online lessons into more conventional courses such as physiology, for example. But I'll show you an example of what I mean. So, and this is not going to load today. More technical difficulties. Here we go. All right, so there's an image up here on the screen and you won't be able to see the detail, and that's okay. So this is from a common group exercise that our case-based class does, and that is to draw a mechanistic diagram that explains the clinical signs. So in this particular example, this is a case given to our second year students fairly early on in the year. We are a 5-year undergraduate program, so our second years would probably be equivalent to more like a first year DVM student. And in this particular case, it's about a dog that ran into a tree and got a stick stuck in its chest. And the students have to explain why this dog is having trouble breathing and the physiological basis behind the vet's treatments. So you can't see the detail here, but the thing to note is that their explanations here are pretty basic. Like, they haven't got much to say about what's going on here. The language is not especially physiological. And really the whole thing is just very linear. They've just got a few ideas and stuck them down, but still they got engaged with the case. And so a few years later, looking at the same case with embedding online lessons in both the physiology and also the case-based courses, we started to get results that are a little bit more akin to this. So this is the same case with students at a similar developmental stage or place in the degree. And this time, there's a few things to note here. So once again, you won't be able to see the detail here, but the important things to note is that the language is a lot more physiological. They seem to have a much better grasp on the concept of homeostasis. They're starting to make a few connections here and there between concepts, which is great. And overall, just the quality of what they've produced is just a whole heap better. And so with results like these, I was much more inspired to just keep going with developing my online lesson skills. And so we'll just talk a little bit now about online lesson design. Okay, while that is loading, because I was going to show you a LT lesson while we're doing that. Okay, here it comes. So when I'm thinking about a lesson and whether I think it's going to be effective or not, I find referring back to cognitive load theory really useful. So if you haven't come across cognitive load theory before, it describes the way we learn basically. And so I'm just going to annotate this little image here to give you an idea of what I mean. So we're constantly bombarded with, all sorts of things coming into our sensory memories. So we're bombarded with things like sight and sound and touch and smells, all these sorts of things coming in to this thing here, which I'm going to call our sensory memory. And a sensory memory has a fairly large capacity, but you don't hold on to things for long. So a lot of stuff that goes into our sensory memory is forgotten pretty quickly. However, if we're absolutely paying attention and there's something there of interest, then we might transfer stuff from our sensory memory into here. And this is our working memory. And the thing to note here about the working memory is, of course, it's got a much smaller capacity than our sensory memory. And so once again, it's pretty easy to forget things from our working memory if we're not actually paying attention. However, if we decide that we would like to work on some stuff within our working memory, if we rehearse it, if we try to make some kind of mental representation of this new information, if we try and organize it in a way that actually makes sense to us, then I'm actually going to call that rehearsal before I forget. So if we rehearse that kind of information with my wonky arrow here, and if we also manage to relate it to something that we already know, and I'm going to call that encoding, then we might be able to transfer it over to here, which is our long-term memory. Okay, and what is great about long-term memories is that once information has entered our long-term memories, we can retrieve it as like a unit or a schema, which takes up very, very little space. So for example, somewhere along the way, you've learnt the characteristics of a dog, what a dog looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, all those sorts of things. And so now when you see a dog, you identify that easily without any mental effort. You can retrieve that information very, very easily, use it for some other thing in your working memory that it relates to. I'm going to put retrieve here. And it's much, much smaller. It's not the components of what makes a dog. You are just identifying it as a dog as a single chunk. And so how is this relevant to online lesson design? Well, the thing to remember here, which is really important, is that these working memories have an extremely limited capacity. So if we want our students to learn, we have to provide them with lots of opportunities to do this rehearsal and encoding and retrieving and just really working with the information to get this mental representation that makes sense to them. But we've got to do that at the same time as making sure that we do not overload the capacity of this working memory. Otherwise, things are just going to fall out and get forgotten. So you might think, well, okay, well, that's not so hard. We just have to make sure that we only feed small amounts of information at a time. And that might seem reasonable, though I think some of you who, like me, teach into a very content-heavy program such as a vet degree might be chuckling a little bit at this stage, thinking, well, that's not incredibly realistic. But there's also some other demands on working memory that are a little less obvious, that are easy to overlook. And so I want to just talk about those next. So just let's look at our working memory in a little bit more detail. So what I've just done here is I've just taken the working memory box from the previous diagram. So here's our incoming information from the sensory memory. Here's some encoding happening, going to my long-term memory, and there might be some retrieval coming in here. And so if this is my working memory, I just want to talk about the types of things that are going on in there. And so within our working memory, there are all sorts of workloads being that are jostling for space, if you like. So first of all, the first one will be what we call an intrinsic workload. And what the intrinsic workload is, it's to do with the difficulty of the topic that you're dealing with. So some topics are inherently more difficult than others, and they're going to take up more space in your working memory. You can only really deal with like one or two aspects of it at a time, because if something is intrinsically difficult, it just takes up more space along the way. And so there are things that we can do as designers to lessen that space that it's taking up, or the impact of this so-called intrinsic workload, such as teaching in small sequential steps, for example, and we'll talk about those a little bit next. And then over here, we've got other stuff here. This, can't spell. This is our extraneous workload, and what extraneous workload is the stuff that does not contribute to learning. And I'm talking about things that are taking up space that require mental processing, but that aren't contributing to the overall goal. So for example, if the lesson includes a lot of detail, which students have to process, but doesn't actually help them get to the learning objective or the learning outcome, a lot of the space is going to get taken up with them trying to process that kind of information. Another example might be if the learning objectives aren't very clear and the student has to go hunting in another place to look for those, or if there's an inconsistency between lecturers. Like last week, the learning objective was at the beginning of the page. This week, I had to go hunting for a separate document to find them. All these things take up processing time and space, and it just means that your students have got less room to work with on the real information. And so lastly, here's the stuff that we really want to talk about, which is the germane workload, okay? And this is the stuff that does, not stiff, stuff that does contribute to learning. What is it about when you're immediately typing in front of somebody else that you forget how? Okay. And so these things are not evenly spaced. So the point I'm trying to make up here is that as designers, we want to do something about reducing this one if we can. We want to minimize this one as much as possible and just shove it into a tiny corner, and then leave heaps and heaps and heaps of space for this germane workload and give students opportunities to actually work with it there. Okay. And so we want to titrate this intrinsic load to the developmental stage of the student, minimize this as much as possible, and then expand this if we can. So let's talk a little bit about how we can do that. Okay, so some strategies. Let's start with some strategies for reducing the intrinsic load that are also going to help students to learn. So Richard Mayer is a researcher from the University of California, and he researches and writes about effective multimedia lesson design quite a lot. And he defines an instructional objective as a description of the intended change in a student's knowledge or skills or attributes, as well as a description of how it will be tested. And so I read this paper many, many, many times before I actually took his advice to not only come up with a learning objective, but to clarify right there and then what achievement of that learning objective is actually going to look like. Because that really helps you to tightly align your objectives and your assessments, and subsequently that tends to guide the look of your instructional message. And it's a lesson that I've probably only really recently taken on board. So these days I spend a lot more time trying to get the objective as clear as possible before I start work on the content. And I always try to write a question at the same time, because sometimes I find that that actually helps me clarify the objective. Now, it's not always going to work that way perfectly. Sometimes it's easier to just start in the middle, get writing, and actually get those two things sorted out a little bit later, but you will save yourself time. So for example, I think only as recently as last year when we were working on the 80 Instruments Physiology collection, one of the instructional designers might say to me, look, I don't think that this question, because we had at the end of each lesson, we have a page of questions that test the learning objectives. And one of the instructional designers would make sure that the objectives and the questions were lining up well. And so he might say, I don't think this question's working out quite so well. Here's some suggestions for how we could align this to the learning objective better. And I would look at the question and go, well, actually, I really like this question, and what you're suggesting is too much. I don't want students to go that far. And so, of course, he would then point out that that meant that my learning objective needed some clarification. And so I would work on that with a little bit of muttering, and we would get that sorted. And then, of course, I would find that the content no longer aligned quite as well as I needed it to. So the emphasis would be slightly off. And so then I would end up spending a few hours actually shuffling that around and adjusting the emphasis to match or align those objectives and those questions. So yeah, if it was just something that I think that I wish that I had learned a little bit quicker, it is that. So wherever possible, try to get your objectives and your assessments lined up. I think I've probably got off my soapbox about that one. And here's another thing, yeah. So I think the other important thing to remember, and one of my other roles in the vet school is to oversee our curriculum. And so I've got that hat on when I'm talking about this particular aspect of learning objectives. Just remember that when you're writing a lesson, that it's just a very, very small part of a big picture. So it might be part of a module, might be part of a course, but that course is also part of like a wider curriculum that this student is actually involved in. So take a little bit of time to check that your objective is not only meeting the short-term goals, but also the longer-term goals, especially these days where our curricula are starting to move towards outcomes and competencies with a lot more emphasis on what students can do with their knowledge versus what they know. So don't forget to just remember that you are teaching, if you're in a preclinical years, that you are teaching towards something that's happening a little bit later in the curriculum as well. And that if you're a clinical teacher, remember what's come before you and how it's actually lining up into what you teach today, and just be mindful of that. So for example, if you are teaching students about the parts of the brain, you might want to be sure that the anatomical classification that you are using for the parts of the brain is the same as what the clinical teacher is going to be doing. And you might decide that it's okay to have different classifications, but each teacher needs to be aware of the other, and so that they're revising if necessary, or pointing out how the students are going to use that information. I hope that that makes sense. However, as I say, I'll get off my curriculum soapbox as well now and move on. Come on, computer, you can do it. Okay, so now getting into the actual part of writing a lesson. I find it really helpful when I'm planning a page to think about the story that I'm wanting to tell, and then to break that story down into a series of logical steps. And then I try to have somebody to check it to make sure that I haven't left out an important part of that story, or if I haven't skipped an important step. So I often find my best work comes about when I'm writing about something that I'm not actually completely comfortable with. So I don't know if you have heard of the conscious competence ladder. So that's the theory that when you're a complete novice, like maybe one of our students getting into a topic for the first time, you are unconsciously incompetent. You have no idea what it is that you don't know. And as you start to learn, you become a little bit more aware of what you don't know. So you become consciously incompetent. As you develop knowledge and skill, you become consciously competent. And then when everything becomes so easy and automatic that you don't have to think about it anymore, then we become then we finally become unconsciously competent. So I've often thought that I teach best at those conscious levels, either consciously competent or even consciously incompetent at times. And so I think it's important that if you are a content expert writing a lesson, that you very deliberately pull yourself back to those conscious levels and think about how it felt to have knowledge at that stage, to make sure that you're including every step that you actually need to. And of course, the other thing to do is to make sure that you have a reviewer who is at those conscious levels, and they can really help a lot with that. So that's where I find students really helpful, often at that conscious incompetence stage, can be really helpful reviewers, and also fairly new graduate veterinarians like residents, for example, who tend to be at that conscious competence stage where their knowledge is very, very new and shiny, are quite good at making sure that you put all the steps into the story and that you keep that story going. Okay, and then other things that are a little bit more intuitive, try and keep to just one main idea per page so that you're not just cluttering up the mind and that the students are just thinking about one thing per page, putting that aside and then moving on. And then subheadings. So I talked to a couple of my students recently and I said to them, so what should I put into the seminar? Like, what's the one message that you would like to give other instructors or teachers who are considering online lessons? And one of them said, and I quote, "For the love of everything I hold dear, please, please, please ask them to include subheadings, more subheadings and even more subheadings." So consider yourself told from a student perspective, though I suspect that might be more to point out that perhaps I haven't used subheadings as much as my students would like. So there you go. Okay, so we've talked about some ideas about reducing intrinsic load, making sure our objectives, our material and our assessments are aligned, telling the story and don't skip the steps, keep to one main idea per page and use lots of subheadings. So now let's talk about extraneous load, like how to remove all the stuff that's not contributing to learning. And any moment now, this will load, I hope. Yeah, here we go. So have a look at this diagram here. You might recognize it as basically the same diagram I gave you a few slides ago about cognitive load, the fact that we have a sensory memory, a working memory, and a long-term memory. But this time I've put in a cute little cartoon, which maybe you can read or you can't read, but it's funny. And there's also a couple of like little quirky bits of information and some pretty colors in there. And that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? Because a bit of humor and a little few fun facts, that kind of thing, are quite good ways to motivate students, aren't they? And that's certainly what a lot of teachers think when they're actually designing when they're designing online lessons. And so whether some humor and some quirky detail motivates students really depends on the actual student. But if my objective is to teach you how people learn in the context of cognitive load theory, then reading information about the location of various structures in the brain or adding a few pictures or giving you a cartoon is irrelevant. All it's doing is cluttering up your working memory with a whole lot of extra information that still requires mental processing, even if you're planning on just forgetting about it straight away, but it doesn't contribute anything to the overall learning goal. So for students who are already familiar with the concept and maybe some experienced learners, they might appreciate the cartoons, but for everyone else, it's absolute clutter that's really preventing them from nailing the original message. So think twice before you start putting in those little extra bits and pieces. And so the really important line in this slide, which unfortunately is just buried down the bottom and maybe some of you can't see it, is only ever include information that leads to better understanding of an important concept. And I have that on a sticky note on my screen and I look at it every day if I'm writing. And I try to remember that. And I find that that particular line is also really helpful for making decisions about the level of detail to include in a lesson. We all like to put way too much detail in. And so I just say to myself, is this information going to lead to better understanding of the topic? And sometimes the answer is yes. Adding a little bit of detail can actually tell the story a bit better, even if it's not going to be part of your learning objective. But sometimes you just have to say, actually, no, it's great. I wish students knew this, but if they're not going to remember it, then there's no point in actually getting them to read it, and cluttering up that working memory. Would be far better off making sure that we have fewer concepts embedded into those long-term memories rather than a whole lot of stuff that's superficially junking up working memory with none of it really making the long-term memory, if that makes sense. Okay, some more ideas. So this particular image, I'll just roll it down a bit. Yeah, I'll forget about the bottom of that page. I'll roll up in a minute. This image here comes from one of Richard Mayer's papers, who's an expert in multimedia learning. And once again, you probably can't see the detail here, but the point he's making is that we've got two line drawings of the brain here. One of them has got labels of the parts of the brain directly on there. And the other one has a legend. So they're labeled A, B, C, D, etc. And then you have to look at the legend to find out what the parts of the brain are actually called. So if your objective is to teach the parts of the brain, then hopefully you'd see that this second diagram here is a lot easier to work with, because you don't have to constantly scan back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to get the information that you need. And this kind of scanning information is extraneous workload. And I always like to think that was the reason that I really couldn't get a grasp on anatomy as a student, because so many of the textbooks, etc., had these incredibly complicated diagrams. Well, not complicated diagrams, but massive amounts of labels. Often, because there were so many labels, you would have to use a legend to actually read them. And I just felt like my brain capacity was just completely over by the time I had actually read that stuff, let alone learning anything along the way. So just if I roll this page up a bit, another couple of just simple things is to make sure that you place your images and your diagrams and your tables in an intuitive manner. So in English, we read from left to right. So it's logical to place your text on the left and your images, your diagrams or whatever on the right. And also make sure that you only use images that are relevant to the text. You can use lots and lots of pretty images, but they need to be relevant. And keep the page clean and uncluttered. So some people worry that it all looks boring if there's lots of white space and it's looking very zen, like this, for example. Personally, I just find it restful, and it means it's easier to concentrate on what's going on. So try to decrease the busyness factor. I don't have any specific evidence for it, but I think that the team that I work with know me well as being a hater of coloured boxes. So if you're going to use colour or emphasize text in coloured boxes, and it's something that's very, very easy to do in LT. No, I won't show you. Very, very easy to LT to actually just put colours around the boxes. Then make sure that you're only doing it sparingly and that you're using it for emphasis. I actually find it quite hard to read text when it's got a coloured background, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. And the second reason I really don't like it is that I get confused about what the import or what's the relevance of the colour. So, you know, if it's coloured green, well, what does that mean? Is that important? Am I missing something? And so immediately, once again, my brain is going into extraneous stuff. Is this something that's important and I've missed it and I don't know? Okay, so now we're getting into what I think is the more interesting stuff about how to encourage students to process their new information. So how do we maximize their germane processing of their new information and get them to come up with that mental representation that makes sense to them, organize it, and then transfer that into their long-term memories. And so this point here is probably the single most useful thing I think that I do as an online lesson writer, and that is to turn every important point into a question. Now, no, I haven't said write about every important point and then ask a question about it, though sometimes that's a good thing to do as well. What I want to do here is actually get students using those important points straight away. So I'll show you an example of what I mean, hopefully here. Okay, so if you have a look at that page there, if I just get rid of this, that would probably help too. Have a look at this page here. It's just a page from an anatomy and physiology lesson. And I'll just give you a bit of time to read that. Okay, so we've got a page here. It's fairly simply set out. We've got a title, we've got a learning objective, that's nice. We've got a little bit of text. There's not a whole heap of text, which is good. It's signaled here that the conducting zone and the respiratory zone are important concepts or important terms. And so it's quite nice that those are bolded to really signal to the students that they need to pay attention to that. There's a diagram here which is relevant to the text and is on the right. It's a simple diagram. It's pretty easy to read. I think my only criticism here would be it's got a couple of terms in it which aren't reflected in the text, which is a bit confusing, such as alveolar ducts and transitional zone. But other than that, it's a pretty nice kind of page. And we could ask a question at the end of it that was perhaps related to differentiating between the conducting and respiratory zones, and that would be perfectly acceptable. Or the other thing we could do is try it like this. And so here's the same page done a little bit differently. Okay, so this time we've got a similar blob of text here, but straight away the students are expected to kind of do something with it. And so there's a question here which kind of like begs for you to do something, like, you know, as soon as you see something like that, you just want to put things into the places, don't you? Well, I know I do, and most students would be that same way. And so what we're trying to do here is get the students to immediately use information which they already had. So I probably should have given you the context here that this is just a page straight out of an anatomy and physiology lesson. And so you haven't seen the pages that it came before that, but the students already have a little bit of knowledge of the anatomy of the respiratory tract. And so we're asking them to retrieve the information that they already have and now use it in the context of conducting versus respiratory zones. And so the question doesn't directly relate to the learning objective. That's not the whole idea here. What it is doing, as I say, is trying to get students to retrieve and use that information. And then they can check their answer and then instantly see here that they've got something wrong and go and sort that out and have another go and think about it. Now, this is a pretty simple question, and there's only like 2 categories here, so it's pretty easy to work out even if you didn't know the answer as to what was actually going on. But I just tried to give you a very, very simple example here, just in terms of time and clarity. So we could also put like a little bit of feedback down here if there was something related to this concept that tended to turn into a misconception. So for example, I don't know, let's say students have trouble working out the difference between respiratory bronchioles and regular bronchioles. You might want to put a little bit of reinforcing text down here if you thought that students were more inclined to put this one over here, for example. Okay, and if I roll this page up a little bit, you can see also at the end of this page, there's another question here that's related to a case. Now, this particular lesson in this particular module has a case study that runs through it. So the students are already familiar with this particular horse and have answered questions about the horse and her case before. But what we're doing is giving the students a fairly simple question, but now in the context of a real animal. And so once again, it's asking them to drag out some information that they've learned prior and now use it in this new context. And then we will follow it up at the end of this particular lesson with a question that directly relates to the learning objective to make sure that they got the point there. Okay. Right. So pre-training, this is another strategy that you can use. Pre-training, I think of as teaching students information one layer at a time. So, for example, if you're going to teach students about the function of each parts of the brain, make sure that they first know the names and the locations of each part. So they've got like a mental map of where everything fits. So it's like, as an analogy, learning about a world map. You're going to start with some continents and some seas rather than getting straight into learning about London, for example. Because if we teach you about London right from the word go, it's going to be hard for you to get a coherent mental representation of what London is if you can't see it in the context of the United Kingdom or Europe or the world and the English Channel and the seas around it. So once again, I'll see if I can get you an example here. So don't look at all the details of this particular page here, but here's a page about the structure of the eye. And we've started off by talking about the 3 layers or tunics of the eye and making sure that students have got like a little bit of an overview of the eye right at the beginning. And then we're going to get into talking about each of these layers in turn, and then we will repeat the diagram. So if I just move to the next page. So now we're just talking about one of those layers. And so we're going to repeat the same diagram and make sure students remember which of these layers respond to what we're talking about right now. So this is what we mean by pre-training. You're just trying to make sure that they've got this map going first before you teach them another layer of information. Another way of using that pre-training principle is to ensure that students have got the prerequisite information before you introduce a new topic. So if I just move to another page here. So in this page here, title, learning objective, if I just roll up here, the very, very first question before we give students any information whatsoever is a revision question, is making sure that they actually know what pulmonary gas exchange is before we introduce some more information. So we're forcing students to try and retrieve information that they've already learned. So that's good rehearsal practice. If they don't remember, then we know that the act of actually trying to retrieve it will help them learn in the future. So that's great. We've got a model answer to make sure that they're on the right track. Stick that in there, give them a bit more information. And then if they didn't know it, they're getting that information there now. And we can be sure that before we move on to adding some more information, that each student is starting the new page with the base that they need to succeed. Okay, rather than not really understanding this concept before we expand on it. Another version of that might be to provide a reminder. So in this page here is about the immune system. So for me, at least, whenever we start talking about the immune system, I can feel my intrinsic workload increasing in my working memory, because for some reason, I just find it really, really difficult to keep a handle on all the cells, what they do, how they interact, all that kind of stuff. And I know that students struggle with that as well, especially when they're learning this for the first time. So if we just move up here to this sentence here, neutrophils and macrophages are the key cells of innate immunity, and blah, blah, blah. And so if you're a student reading this, you might be going, okay, yeah, they're cells of innate immunity. What are the other ones again? How do they fit into the family tree? How does that all work, for example? Now, asking them to retrieve that information might be a little bit much at this particular point in time. And so what we can do instead is just give them a bit of a crutch. So we've got this little pop-up window, and they can go, oh, right, that's right. Neutrophils are leukocytes and they're granulocytes, and macrophages are just one kind of monocyte, and that's an agranulocyte. Yeah, okay, I get it now. That's fine. I'm happy. I can keep going. So those reminders can also be really, really useful for helping students just get the information they need to keep going and to keep learning. All right, what else we got? So understanding and retrieval. Right, another strategy that we use, which is sort of part of motivation as well, is to ask questions in lots and lots of different formats. So we ask questions embedded within a page and at the end of lessons, and find that those are really good for motivating students, but also for getting them to actively use the information as they're learning it. So instead of reading a whole page of text, they might just read a little bit of text and then do something with it. Have a question. And you can use questions in really, really simple forms. So for example, this particular question here, it's just a definition and matching question, but somehow it's just so much more interesting to read a definition and try and match it than it is to just read that as a blob of text, especially when you can check your answer at the end and make sure that you're okay. All right, here's just an example of a simple labeling diagram, and you can make these more or less difficult by adding more labels than they need, or adding more labels than are actually necessary here as well, so that students have to discriminate. The annotate question is what I used earlier with those working memory diagrams, and annotate's really useful when you want the students to actually come up with the name of a label themselves. So rather than just labeling something that's already there, they've actually got to do the drawing, whatever. Fabulous for things like radiographs, really cool for practical stuff like putting up an image of an anesthetic machine and then saying, how are you going to turn on the oxygen? Where's the bobbin going to go? That kind of thing. Table questions, fantastic for summaries at the end. So the student creates a summary of the information themselves in the table, but also it turns into a question as well. So they also have to retrieve that information at the same time. And then all sorts of kind of like putting things in here can be as complicated and as easy as you like. And this one's a little bit more challenging for students to work out. Right, what else did I actually have to say? I think that also, as well as helping students get that representation of material, this constant active retrieval practice is really good for trying to teach students better study habits. So we find that despite their good grades and their achievements at school, etc., that a lot of our students enter the program with quite a reliance on passive and ineffective techniques. And we can teach them about how to do that a little bit better, but it's quite often hard to change this habit. So giving them examples of how active learning can really, really make a difference in a fun kind of way does at least help to reinforce that message. Okay, and I think just about finally, just another word about motivation. Trying to put case-based material in where possible. I think we all know that vet students love case studies, and that can be quite challenging in the early years. But I have learned that just asking quite simple questions in the context of a case is really motivating for those junior students when they feel like they can answer a question with the knowledge that they already have. And lastly, I would say, make sure that your style stays conversational. It's probably one of the most off-putting things I find about most textbooks is that they have this quite formal language. So the more conversational that you can make the style when you're actually writing, the more engaged students become with it. And apparently how it works is that if there's a conversational style, even though there's nobody actually there, students kind of get that social partnership feeling going, that somebody actually cares about them. And obviously you need to follow that up with face-to-face contact as well. But it does actually help with their motivation. Okay, so in summary, here's a few things that are worth thinking about. Get your learning objectives aligned, constructively aligned with your material and assessments. Review as much as possible, especially with people that are a little bit closer to your target audience. Break things into segments and tell that story. Get rid of anything that you don't need and be fairly brutal about it. Make sure you've got your text next to your graphic and that you're minimizing that scanning. Make sure you've provided an overall map of where these new concepts fit into the overall picture. Get students involved in cases, be conversational, revise key concepts and don't be afraid to get students to revise all the time, and encourage active learning as much as you can. And at the bottom here, I've got 2 references. So obviously there's a huge body of literature about online learning and lesson design, and I've just scratched the surface of it. Tons and tons of stuff out there that you can read, but these are 2 papers that I come back to again and again that I would highly recommend. So have a look at those if you'd like to learn some more. And Charlotte, I think I have talked plenty, so I'm happy to stop here and see if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. I was going to share my screen and take us to a Q&A page, but I actually think that sitting on the summary page with the recommended reading is really good for people who might want to soak that in and also take note of those references. So thank you so much for that presentation. We have had a few questions come through, and I just wanted to give you a minute to catch your breath before we dip into those. If anybody does have any further questions, please add them in the Q&A dialogue box now. In addition, I'd like to launch this poll asking whether you'd like to be contacted by the 80 Instruments team to learn more about LT, which is the interface that Nick has been showing you today. Your responses are appreciated. I'll give the poll and the Q&A a few more seconds, maybe 30 seconds to a minute, to get some responses coming in, and then we'll get started on those questions. All right, I'll leave that poll open for another 30 seconds or so. But Nick, I'll bring you back to the floor. So the first question we have is, how have your students responded to these online lessons?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because there's not much point if they hate them, is there? Most of the time, let me rephrase that, I'll start again. So overall, the response has been really, really positive. Students overall appreciate the idea of an online lesson in terms of that flexibility. Like, we find that even with vet students in a fairly intensive program, more and more of them have got family responsibilities, part-time work, all sorts of things going on. So the flexibility is huge, and they really like that, and they like being able to regulate the pace. So another thing that we see more and more of is students that would identify as neurodiverse, or have got cultural responsibilities or attitudes or ways of thinking that are just generally a little bit different from our standard Western response. So having the time to work out the information and to use it in a way that suits them is really, really appreciated. In terms of the actual lesson and having the content presented that way, once again, overall the response is really positive. Like, students like that active approach, but in a reasonably fun way. Some of them would complain that there's still too much text, but honestly, you know, students just don't want to read this these days. And I sometimes think, I really don't give you more than a paragraph at a time, but even so, there will be a bit of that. There are some students who would definitely appreciate a video component to this. And I think that one thing that we would like to do in the future is for some of the trickier concepts, probably just have like a little short kind of like 4 or 5 minute video that would explain that, either with a lecturer using something like a light board, or even just like a short animation with a narration over the top. And I think that that would be really valuable to add. But having said that, there's always a few students that don't like it. But I'm no different from any other kind of teaching method that I've used in the past. As I say, there's always somebody that doesn't want to do it that way, and that would rather sit in a lecture and just sort of be told what to do. But there you go.
And I wonder also, with this new approach with online learning, how that relates to traditional didactic teaching and lectures. What space do lectures have in your curriculum now?
We still have a lot of lectures in our curriculum. In the first and second year, spaces a lot less than we did. So for example, if I was doing online physiology lessons, the way that we would use them is perhaps, my preference would be something like a team-based learning setup, where we've got the lessons as the pre-learning, students coming along to some quiz or case-related kind of exercises to do that with. Our second year class, for example, do case studies in small groups every Friday, and they also have like an interactive tutorial along the week to support their learning with that. So I think it's very, very important to make sure that the face-to-face contact is still part of it. It's very easy for me to get enthusiastic about the online stuff because I really do like it, but the face-to-face stuff is critical for making this work. Online lessons are only as good as the course design overall and how they're actually used. So yeah, you can have a good and a bad online lesson, but you can also have a good and a bad course design. So your online lessons do need to be used appropriately, and students still need to feel supported. Did I answer that? I'm not sure I did, Charlotte.
I think you did. I think you did.
Okay,
and we had one more question that was thinking about, I know that in your presentation, you briefly mentioned the immune system and how often there's so much information that you need to talk about when teaching that topic. What concepts are most difficult for your students? Are there concepts that pop up every year that you know students are going to struggle with, and how do you approach that?
Related to the immune system or just in general?
In general, across the curriculum.
In general. I think that as you gain experience, there are always some things that do pop up again and again. So the immune system would be a bad example for me because I don't directly teach it, and it's just not my area of expertise. It's probably why I put that that page up. But for me, as an ex-clinical anaesthetist, I'm usually most interested in the respiratory and the cardiovascular system, and I can tell you right now that students struggle with the idea of cardiac output on a fairly regular basis, just because it's so many, there's so many factors involved in it. It's not just stroke volume and heart rate. The stroke volume's got 3 factors that contribute to it too as well. So that multifactorial nature, I find, does the head of the average student in quite regularly. And it's just something that you just need to come back to and use in a clinical context as much as possible. Respiratory is another one. Most people love to hate respiratory because the physics sometimes derails them. So I tend to teach respiratory physiology by taking quite a lot of the physics out, which pains me in many, many ways. But I think as an introduction, it takes away some of the fear of, and some of the equations, taking some of those away and just talking through it from a sensible, word-based kind of way does help an awful lot of students. We still have the equations available for those that are a bit more mathematically inclined, but these days that seems to be fewer and fewer students. So is that the kind of thing that you're after there? But yeah, I think every physiology teacher would have a list of things that they think students regularly develop misconceptions about.
And we've just had one comment come in saying that somebody's had to go to a tutorial, but they say, thank you for this. It was a very useful session. So that's great. And did somebody just raise their hand in the audience? If you do have a question, you can add it in the Q&A. For the moment, we've reached the end of our question list. So unless one more comes in the next 30 seconds or so, I'd like to thank Nicola once again for this presentation. It has been recorded and we will circulate that to all registrants. Thank you so much for your live attendance. We know how busy educators are. And thank you once again to our speaker, Nicola. Have a great day, everybody.